Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. When Zora Neale Hurston published Their Eyes Were Watching God in 1937, the literary world barely stirred. At the time, Hurston's voice, distinct, rooted in the rhythms of Black Southern dialect, and fiercely centered on a Black woman's self-realization, was seen as out of step with the dominant political literature of the Harlem Renaissance. Critics, including some of her peers like Richard Wright, dismissed the novel as apolitical or even regressive, accusing it of pandering to white audiences with its folkloric portrayal of rural Black life. And so, for decades, the book lay quietly in the shadows. But time and generations of readers saw something else, something richer, braver, and far more enduring. By the 1970s, amid the swell of Black feminist thought and the re-evaluation of overlooked voices, Their Eyes Were Watching God was rediscovered. Writers like Alice Walker championed Hurston's work, calling her a genius and bringing the novel back into the light. Today, it stands as one of the most important works of American literature. A lyrical, powerful exploration of race, gender, love, and autonomy. It's a novel that doesn't just follow a woman's journey, it listens to her voice. And in doing so, it gifts readers with one of the most vibrant, complex, and fully realized protagonists in all of literature, Janie Crawford. At its heart, Their Eyes Were Watching God is the story of a woman who refuses to be silenced. Told in a rich blend of poetic narration and colloquial dialogue, the novel traces Janie's search for her own horizon, not one defined by a man or a community, but by her own desires, her own truth. Through 3 marriages, losses, migrations, and returns, Janie's journey unfolds as both intensely personal and quietly revolutionary. She grows not by breaking away from her community, but by understanding her place within it, and by daring to shape that place on her own terms. Zora Neale Hurston, herself a brilliant anthropologist and storyteller, drew heavily from her own upbringing in Eatonville, Florida, one of the first all-Black incorporated towns in America, and from her travels through the American South collecting folklore. Her writing is deeply rooted in the oral traditions and lived experiences of Black Southerners. With Their Eyes Were Watching God, she infused that authenticity into a novel that is at once deeply specific and universally resonant. The novel is layered with powerful themes: the tension between speech and silence, the burden of gender expectations, the search for freedom and fulfillment, the resilience of Black identity in the face of both internal and external pressures. It does not offer easy answers or linear resolutions. Instead, it gives us Janie, flawed, luminous, and real, navigating the messiness of life and love with a strength that often surprises even herself. As we journey through this summary, we will stay close to Janie's perspective, following her voice through the swamps of Florida, down dusty roads and sun-soaked porches, through moments of great sorrow and fleeting joy. We will meet men who try to own her, towns that try to shape her, and finally, a moment of reckoning that lets her reclaim her story, not as someone's wife or someone's dream, but as herself. Now, let's begin where the novel begins, with Janie returning home in the fading light of the late afternoon, while the rest of the town gossips from their porches. She walks alone in overalls, with her long hair loose down her back, a woman with a story. And she's ready to tell it. The sun was sinking low over the horizon when Janie Crawford returned to Eatonville, the town where she had once been the mayor's wife and the object of endless speculation. Her return was quiet, marked not by ceremony, but by silence. She came walking alone down the main road in a pair of muddy overalls, her long hair still thick and untamed, flowing freely down her back. The townspeople watched from their porches, curious and hungry for gossip. They noted her clothes, her gait, the absence of her husband, and the strange light in her eyes, a light that seemed more reflective than broken. They didn't know what she had seen or where she had been, but they knew a story clung to her like the dust on her shoes. As Janie passed them without a glance, the porch sitters whispered and speculated. Some remembered her beauty, once the talk of the town. Others remembered her pride, her silence, her laughter, her husband's, and the last one, Tea Cake, who was nowhere in sight. But Janie said nothing to them. She kept walking until she reached the house she used to share with him, where her friend Phoebe Watson soon followed. Phoebe wasn't like the others. She came not to pry, but to listen. She brought Janie a plate of food and offered a kind ear. And in return, Janie offered her something greater, the truth. Not the version the town would invent for itself, but the real story, told in Janie's voice in her own time. And so she began, not with Tea Cake or her return, but with a memory of a girl beneath a blossoming pear tree. She was 16 then, raised by her grandmother, Nanny, in a white family's backyard. Janie's earliest awareness of herself had been as a photograph, discovered one day in someone's album, where she realized, to her own shock, that she was not white. The moment was subtle but world-altering. It marked the beginning of her self-recognition, a realization that she was different and would be treated differently. But what consumed her in those years was not race, or labor, or expectation. It was the pear tree. That tree, in full bloom, had become a symbol of something larger than herself, of harmony, fulfillment, and passion. She had watched the bees pollinate the blossoms and imagined love as a natural thing, an inevitable unfolding of beauty and connection. It was under that tree that she dreamed of what her life could be. And it was shortly after that dream that Nanny crushed it with a marriage proposal. Nanny was old and had suffered. Born into slavery, raped by her white master, and later raising Janie alone, she had seen too much of the world's cruelty to leave her granddaughter vulnerable to it. She wanted security for Janie, not passion. So she married her off to Logan Killicks, an older farmer with land, a mule, and little else. Janie didn't love him. She didn't even understand what marriage truly meant. But Nanny insisted that love would come later, that respect and stability would protect her from the life Nanny had endured. Janie obeyed, but the marriage felt cold and hard, like the tools Logan used on his farm. There were no blooming trees, no bees, no song. She tried to make herself believe that love might arrive, unannounced, like the seasons, but it never did. Instead, Logan expected her to work the fields, to shovel manure, to be useful. He didn't want a dreamer. He wanted a mule. It wasn't long before Janie began to chafe under the weight of that life. Her spirit, so drawn to the idea of love and possibility, could not settle into the rhythm of drudgery. And then one day, as she walked down the road, she saw a man in a stylish coat, walking with confidence and purpose. His name was Joe Starks, and he was everything Logan was not. Ambitious, charming, and full of grand ideas, Joe spoke of towns yet to be built, futures waiting to be claimed. He told Janie she deserved more, that she should be a big voice, a woman beside a man with vision. He promised her a new life, and she believed him. So she left Logan. She took a chance, stepping into the unknown, and followed Joe to Eatonville, a town that was still in its infancy. Together, they built something. Joe bought land, opened a store, and soon became mayor. Janie became the mayor's wife, a role with prestige, admiration, and also invisible shackles. At first, Janie was dazzled by the attention and the energy of the town, but it didn't take long for the walls to close in. Joe wanted her to look the part, to dress fine, to tie up her hair, to stay silent on the porch while he held court with the townsmen. Her voice, once so full of wonder and longing, was pushed aside. She was expected to be seen, not heard. Her thoughts were dismissed, her independence smothered beneath the weight of his ego. Years passed. The town grew, and so did Joe's pride. He grew domineering, even cruel, especially when he felt insecure. He insulted Janie in front of others, called her old, silenced her with mockery. And through it all, Janie endured. But inside, something began to stir again, the same restless energy that had driven her from Logan's farm. Her soul, once bound by duty and appearances, began to stretch and breathe. Now, sitting on her front porch with Phoebe, Janie was ready to tell it all, not just the facts, but the feelings behind them. She wasn't the same woman Eatonville had once known. She had lived beyond their small talk and expectations. She had searched for love, lost it, found it again, and come to understand her own voice. And that voice was about to speak, not for them, but for herself. The sun kept rising and setting on Eatonville, but time moved differently inside the walls of Janie's marriage to Joe Starks. On the surface, she had everything most women were supposed to want: a respectable home, the finest clothes, a husband who had elevated her to prominence. She was the mayor's wife, a woman whose life was defined by order and attention. But under the surface, the pear tree dream had begun to wither. Janie had stepped into what looked like power, only to find herself boxed in by a man who mistook control for love. Joe had ambition in his bones. He thrived on admiration, needing the town's respect like others needed air. With his booming voice and tailored suits, he cast a long shadow over Eatonville. He opened a general store, built a post office, installed the first street lamp. He became the town's voice, its leader, its symbol. But in building his empire, he had no room for Janie to grow beside him. Instead, he kept her behind the counter of their store, neat and pretty, as if she were a fixture on display. Janie worked without complaint, selling goods, handing out mail, passing coins across the counter. But her presence was not her own. It was curated, molded, controlled. Joe insisted she wear her hair up in a head rag, hiding the long, thick strands that had once drawn so much attention. Her hair, a symbol of her identity and sensuality, became something he possessed rather than something she expressed. It wasn't just jealousy. It was ownership. He didn't want other men to admire her, but more than that, he didn't want her to feel admired unless it came from him. In town, the men would gather outside the store to talk, to laugh, to swap tall tales and small dreams. Janie would listen from behind the screen door, her hands busy but her mind wandering. Sometimes she longed to join them, to add her voice to the porch talk, to be heard not just as Joe Stark's wife but as herself. But Joe didn't allow it. He said a woman's place was to listen, not to speak. And so Janie fell silent, storing her thoughts deep inside like seeds waiting for rain. The years passed with little joy. Joe's success only deepened his need for control, and his control only deepened Janie's sense of isolation. He corrected her in public, belittled her intellect, snapped at her in front of others. Once, when she cooked a dinner he didn't like, he struck her. A moment that seared itself into her memory not for its pain, but for what it confirmed. She wasn't his partner. She was his reflection, and any imperfection in her felt to him like a crack in his image. But Janie was not made to be invisible. The spirit that once ran wild under the pear tree still lived within her, buried beneath years of silence, but not extinguished. And slowly, that spirit began to rise. It happened quietly, in the way she held her head when he spoke, in the way her eyes lingered on the horizon beyond the store's windows, in the way her silence thickened, not in submission, but in resistance. Then one day, the breaking point came. Joe, feeling older and more insecure, insulted her in front of a crowd of men in the store, mocking her body and her age. The laughter of the others burned in her ears. And something inside her broke, not in pain, but in clarity. She stood and spoke, not with anger, but with truth. She reminded him that he was not the man he pretended to be, that his cruelty did not diminish her, but exposed his own weakness. Her words landed with finality. For the first time, the town saw not just the mayor's wife, but Janie, a woman with fire behind her eyes. After that, Joe withdrew. His health had begun to fail, and now his pride was sick too. He stopped speaking to her, retreated into silence, and eventually took to his sick. Janie tended to him, not out of love, but out of duty and a sense of closure. In those final days, she looked him in the eyes and told him the truth, that he had never really known her, never tried to. That he had loved his own image more than he had ever loved her. Joe died with that truth hanging in the air, unacknowledged but undeniable. After the funeral, Janie stood alone. She wore the black dress, accepted the condolences, played the role. But inside, something had shifted. She felt not grief, but release. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone, not under the thumb of a grandmother or a husband, not trapped in someone else's dream. She stood before a mirror and let down her hair, untwisting the rag and shaking her thick braid free. It was an act of quiet rebellion and also of return, a return to herself. The town watched her closely in the weeks that followed, expecting a performance of mourning, a display of proper widowhood. But Janie didn't play to their expectations. She moved differently, thought differently. She began to live in her house not as a possession, but as a home. She ran the store on her own terms, spoke when she wanted, walked alone when she pleased. And the gossip continued, of course, about her hair, her laughter, her solitude. But Janie had learned by now how to ignore the noise. She had lived too long in other people's stories. Now, she was ready to write her own. It was in this season of solitude and self-discovery that a new chapter began to stir. One that would bring her love, not as fantasy or illusion, but as companionship, play, and partnership. She didn't seek it out. It came to her unexpected, like a gust of wind on a still day. a man appeared, younger, with a gambler's grin and a guitar slung across his back. His name was Virgable Woods, but everyone called him Tea Cake. And with him came something Janie hadn't felt in years, possibility. Tea Cake arrived in Eatonville, like a storm on the horizon. Unexpected, a little wild, and impossible to ignore. He wasn't like the other men in town, not like Joe or the older men who had always seen Janie as something to be admired from a distance, an object on display. Tea Cake was different, with his playful grin and easygoing nature. He didn't seem to notice Janie's widowhood. He didn't see her as something to pity or something to be put on a pedestal. He saw her as a woman who could laugh, who could live fully. And that recognition was something she hadn't realized she needed so badly. It was in the small, everyday moments that Tea Cake began to change Janie's world. At first, he just showed up at the store now and then, chatting with her as if they were old friends. The simplicity of his conversations, the easy teasing, and the way he made her feel like she wasn't just another woman in a long line of broken dreams, were a sharp contrast to the heavy, controlling atmosphere of her marriage to Joe. With Tea Cake, there was no performance. He didn't try to make her fit into a mold. He just let her be. Janie, still cautious but intrigued, found herself drawn to him. Tea Cake wasn't a man who followed the rules. He was a wanderer, a man without much in terms of possessions, but with a wealth of joy and an undeniable sense of freedom. He lived for the moment, for the here and now, and he invited Janie into that world with him. He taught her to play checkers, to laugh without restraint, to move beyond the tight boundaries that had defined her life for so long. Each time they spent together, Janie felt something inside her stir. The dormant part of herself that had been buried by years of loneliness and silence. The part that had once dreamed under the shade of the pear tree. The more Janie and Tea Cake spent time together, the more she began to feel alive again. There was something liberating in the way he didn't just speak to her, he listened. He noticed the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, the way she lit up when she told stories of her life. Tea Cake was the first person to truly see her, not as someone's wife or someone's possession, but as a woman with her own desires, her own voice. And so, in a small, unexpected moment, Janie found herself falling in love. At first, she resisted the feeling, unsure of its implications. She had been burned before, and the idea of opening her heart again seemed reckless. But Tea Cake wasn't like Joe. He didn't ask her to change, he only encouraged her to remember the woman she had once been, and to embrace the woman she was becoming. Love, for him, was not about ownership, but about partnership. Something shared, something spontaneous, something joyful. Their relationship, though new, blossomed quickly. Tea Cake took her on walks around the town, and they would stop at the Everglades for picnics, surrounded by the wild, untamed beauty of nature. They would dance in the evenings, just the two of them, as if the world outside of their small bubble didn't matter. Tea Cake had a way of making Janie feel as though the world was hers to take, as though she could be anything she wanted, anywhere she wanted. He showed her that the joy of life wasn't in material wealth or societal status, but in simple moments of connection, laughter, and love. When Tea Cake proposed to Janie, it was not with grand gestures or promises of a life of luxury. It was a simple, honest request, spoken with a lightness in his voice that seemed to match the ease of their relationship. He asked her to come away with him, to leave the confines of Eatonville and the expectations of her past behind. Tea Cake didn't promise her that life would be perfect or that there wouldn't be hardships. What he offered was companionship, freedom, and the chance to write her own story once again. But Janie hesitated. She had spent so many years under the shadow of other people's expectations. First her grandmother's, then Joe's. And now, even though Tea Cake's love was a breath of fresh air, the decision to leave everything behind felt daunting. Would she be making the right choice? Could she trust herself to follow her heart, or would it lead her into more pain? But Tea Cake's persistence, his unwavering belief in their love, eventually swayed her. They left Eatonville together, embarking on a journey that took them away from the rigid confines of the town and into the unpredictable flow of life. The Everglades became their new home, a place where they could live on their own terms, away from the judgment of the world. The people there lived differently, but with a similar spirit of resilience and joy. Janie, for the first time in a long while, felt as though she had found a place where she could truly be herself. Living with Tea Cake was a world apart from the suffocating life she had once known. She found herself laughing more, dancing more, and even learning to work in the fields alongside him. The days were hard, and they often worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, but the work was different. It didn't feel like an obligation to maintain an image or to fulfill a role. It felt like a shared endeavor, a way of building a life together, one step at a time. For Janie, Tea Cake became more than just a lover. He became her partner in every sense of the word. He made her feel valued, not because of what she could give him, but simply for who she was. With him, she could breathe deeply, free from the weight of expectations. In those quiet, stolen moments, Janie remembered what it was like to be a woman with dreams, a woman who could love without fear. But even in the midst of her happiness, Janie knew that life was not without its struggles. Tea Cake had his flaws, his own insecurities, and the challenges they faced were far from over. Still, as the seasons shifted and the days grew longer, Janie felt the weight of the past slipping away. She no longer defined herself by what had been lost, but by what was possible, by the love and the freedom she had found in Tea Cake's arms. With him, she was no longer just surviving, she was truly living. Janie and Tea Cake's life in the Everglades was far from the comfort and predictability of Eatonville. The couple found themselves living in a world where the elements, the land, and the people were wild and unpredictable. A far cry from the life Janie had known in the more controlled surroundings of her previous marriage. But there was something about this place that felt different, something that awakened a new spirit in Janie. Their days were filled with labor, working the fields alongside other seasonal workers who came to harvest the crops of the fertile land. Though the work was grueling, there was a sense of camaraderie among the workers that made it bearable. They laughed, joked, and helped each other with the backbreaking tasks, creating a community that was unlike the rigid social structures Janie had previously encountered. She had grown accustomed to the wealth and status that had been part of her marriage to Joe. But here, in the fields of the Everglades, everything was stripped down to its simplest form. There was no grand hierarchy, no judgment based on appearance or wealth, only the labor and the shared experience of the people working together. Tea Cake, for all his charm and lightheartedness, worked just as hard as anyone else. He was no stranger to the physical toil that came with working in the fields, and Janie, following his lead, threw herself into the work with a determination she hadn't known she had. Tea Cake never asked her to work. He never made her feel like she had to prove herself. But Janie saw in him a sense of purpose and responsibility that she admired. In his eyes, they were partners in every sense of the word, and there was no task too hard for the two of them to face together. What made their relationship different from the one Janie had with Joe was the way Tea Cake treated her. He didn't expect her to be perfect, nor did he demand that she live up to some idealized version of womanhood. He didn't seek to control her as Joe had done. He simply wanted her to be herself. Tea Cake's love was not possessive. It wasn't about ownership or power. It was about equality, mutual respect, and joy. And in return, Janie found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't before. She was no longer the quiet, dutiful wife who kept her thoughts to herself. Tea Cake encouraged her to speak her mind, to share her stories, to live freely without the burden of silence or fear. They laughed together, they cried together, and in each other's company, they discovered what it meant to truly love without conditions. But love, no matter how pure, is not immune to the complexities of life. In the Everglades, things were not always easy. As the couple settled into their new life, they faced challenges that tested both their bond and their resilience. One of the first obstacles came in the form of a tragic event, a deadly hurricane that swept through the region and ravaged the land. It was a storm that seemed to come out of nowhere, a violent reminder of the unpredictability of nature and the fragility of life. The hurricane's fury was unlike anything Janie had ever experienced. The winds howled, the waters rose, and the once calm and peaceful Everglades became a place of chaos and destruction. The workers in the fields, the people who had once been so full of life, were suddenly thrown into survival mode, struggling against the relentless forces of nature. Tea Cake, who had always been the one to keep Janie laughing and carefree, was now the one who kept her calm and focused as the storm raged around them. In the midst of the storm's fury, Janie clung to him for strength, for guidance, for protection. The hurricane was an ordeal that brought Janie and Tea Cake closer together in ways they hadn't expected. The storm was a test of their love and their ability to survive together. They faced the storm with a quiet resolve, knowing that they had each other to lean on. It was in this moment, amidst the chaos and destruction, that Janie realized just how deeply she had come to depend on Tea Cake. He was not just the man who had swept her off her feet with his charm and humor. He was the man who had become her anchor, her protector, and her equal. As the storm passed and the damage to the land became evident, Janie and Tea Cake found themselves facing the aftermath together. The hurricane had torn apart the landscape, destroyed homes, and taken lives, but it had also forged a deeper bond between the couple. In the face of such adversity, they were more united than ever. They had survived the storm, and they had done so together. However, the storm also exposed the fragility of their existence. Their life in the Everglades was built on the precariousness of nature's whims, and even as they rebuilt, they knew that their happiness was not guaranteed. They were living in a world that could change at any moment, a world where survival was a daily struggle. But the hurricane also symbolized something else, the unpredictability of life itself. Just as the storm had swept through without warning, so too could their love be tested in ways they could not anticipate. The knowledge that life could change in an instant made the moments they shared together all the more precious. The storm had reminded them that nothing in life was permanent, that everything could be swept away in an instant. But despite this, Janie and Tea Cake had each other, and that was something no storm could take away. In the aftermath of the hurricane, as the couple worked together to rebuild their lives, they found a new sense of purpose. The storm had destroyed so much, but it had also brought them closer. Janie began to realize that the love she shared with Tea Cake was not a fleeting thing, but something solid and enduring. It was a love that could weather any storm, no matter how fierce or unpredictable. Through all the struggles and hardships they faced, Janie understood one fundamental truth. Love, real love, was not about perfection or safety. It was about resilience, about facing the storms of life together, and about finding joy in the moments of calm that followed. Tea Cake had shown her what it meant to live fully, to embrace life with all its uncertainties and challenges, and to find beauty in the struggle. As the days turned into months, Janie began to understand that her journey with Tea Cake was not just about love, but about finding her own strength, her own voice, and her own sense of freedom. Tea Cake had given her the space to be herself, to discover who she was without the weight of other people's expectations. And in this freedom, Janie found her true self, a woman who could laugh, who could love, and who could face whatever life threw at her with courage and grace. As Janie and Tea Cake continued their life together in the Everglades, their relationship grew deeper, not just through their shared moments of love and joy, but also through the trials they faced. The life they were building together was filled with challenges, from the everyday struggles of survival in a rough environment to more personal battles that tested their bond. Yet through it all, they seemed to remain unshaken, a testament to the strength of their love and the partnership they had built. One of the most profound aspects of their life together was the simplicity they found in each other's company. The hustle and bustle of their day-to-day existence, though often exhausting, felt meaningful because they had each other. They would wake up early to work the fields, hand in hand with the other laborers, but always with a sense of purpose, of belonging. They were a part of something larger, and yet they had a unique and personal connection that was theirs alone. But even in this seemingly idyllic environment, conflict would inevitably arise. One of the pivotal moments in their relationship came when Tea Cake's playful nature, a quality Janie had always loved, led to an incident that tested their trust. Tea Cake, who had always been affectionate and jovial, started showing an interest in a local woman, Nunky. He was playful with her in a way that stirred Janie's jealousy. Nunky's presence seemed to ignite something deep within Janie, a feeling she had never had to confront before, a vulnerability she had never experienced in her previous marriages. She felt threatened by the idea of another woman taking her place in Tea Cake's heart. For the first time, Janie began to question her relationship with Tea Cake. Was their love as strong as she thought? Could it be easily swayed by someone else's charm or flirtation? This moment was one of the first cracks in their seemingly perfect life, but it was also a moment of profound growth for Janie. Her jealousy was not just about Tea Cake and Nunky. It was about her own insecurities, her fear of losing the one person who had made her feel loved and valued in a way no one else ever had. Tea Cake, on the other hand, was unaware of the depth of Janie's feelings. His carefree nature led him to believe that Janie was simply being playful and overreacting, which added to her frustration. It was during this tense moment that Janie had to decide how much she was willing to tolerate in her relationship. Could she let go of her fear of loss and allow Tea Cake to be who he was? Or would she allow her jealousy to consume her? The confrontation between Janie and Tea Cake was inevitable, and when it came, it was both heartbreaking and liberating. Tea Cake, sensing the change in Janie, took the time to reassure her. He wasn't interested in Nunky, he explained, and his affection for Janie had not waned. His playful nature was simply a part of who he was. This moment marked a turning point for Janie. She had to confront her own insecurities and understand that love, true love, required trust. Tea Cake wasn't like Joe, who had sought to control her, to make her his possession. Tea Cake had always seen her as his equal, and it was in that moment that Janie truly understood what love with freedom looked like. Despite the tension that lingered in the air, Janie and Tea Cake's bond grew stronger after this confrontation. They were able to move past the incident, not because the jealousy had disappeared, but because they learned to trust each other in ways they hadn't before. Janie learned that love wasn't about perfection or control. It was about accepting each other's flaws and quirks, understanding that no one, not even the one you love most, is perfect. In this, they found the true meaning of partnership. However, life in the Everglades was never as predictable as they might have hoped. Their newfound happiness would soon be tested once again, this time by the forces of nature. The Everglades, which had brought them so much peace and fulfillment, was also a place of danger. And it was in the midst of this danger that Tea Cake, Janie, and the other workers in the fields would face the ultimate test of their survival. A deadly, unforeseen hurricane that would turn their world upside down. The hurricane arrived with an intensity that no one had anticipated. The winds howled ferociously, the sky darkened, and the land seemed to be swallowed by the fury of nature. The storm came without warning, and soon, Janie and Tea Cake found themselves in the midst of a battle for their very lives. The fear that had crept into Janie's heart during the earlier moments of doubt seemed small in comparison to the sheer terror of the hurricane. Together, they fought to survive, clinging to each other as the world around them disintegrated. Tea Cake, ever the protector, kept Janie close, doing everything in his power to shield her from the worst of the storm. The couple sought refuge in whatever they could find, trying to ride out the worst of the hurricane. The storm was an unpredictable and violent force of nature. But in those moments, it became clear to Janie that their love, their bond, was what would ultimately keep them grounded. In the chaos of the hurricane, Janie realized something profound about her relationship with Tea Cake. She had come to depend on him in ways she hadn't even fully realized before. He was no longer just the man who made her laugh and filled her life with joy. He was now the person she would trust with her life. She was willing to risk everything for him, just as he had done for her. When the storm finally passed, the devastation was unimaginable. Homes were destroyed, crops were wiped out, and the land that had once been a place of life and possibility was now a desolate wasteland. Yet, amidst the wreckage, Janie and Tea Cake were alive, and that was all that mattered. They were not untouched by the storm, but they had made it through together. In the aftermath, Janie's understanding of love deepened. Love wasn't just about romantic gestures or moments of joy. It was about surviving the hardest of times and still being there for each other. It was about finding a way to live through the storms of life and come out stronger on the other side. Tea Cake and Janie had faced the hurricane as a team, and in doing so, they had proven to themselves that nothing, not even the wrath of nature, could tear them apart. The aftermath of the hurricane left Janie and Tea Cake in a landscape that was nearly unrecognizable. The Everglades, once lush and teeming with life, had been transformed into a desolate, devastated land. Their home, the small cabin they had worked so hard to build, was destroyed, and all the crops they had tended to with such care were ruined. The future that had seemed so promising just days before now appeared uncertain, and yet, through all of this, Janie and Tea Cake remained alive and together. This was their greatest victory, and it was clear that their bond had been tested, but not broken. Janie had always believed that life had a way of pushing people to their limits, but she had never known such profound loss and hardship until the hurricane swept through. The storm had not only ravaged the land, but it had also forced Janie to confront the fragility of her own existence. She had always been a strong woman, but now she understood the delicate balance between life and death, the fine line that separated her joy from sorrow. In the wake of the storm, Janie and Tea Cake were left with little more than each other, but that was enough. It was in this new world, stripped of everything they had known, that Janie began to truly understand the depth of her love for Tea Cake. The challenges they now faced were no longer just about surviving the harsh conditions of the Everglades, but about finding meaning in their struggle, about building a life out of the remnants of the old one. Tea Cake, ever resourceful, was determined to rebuild their life together. He took it upon himself to find ways to make money, even if it meant taking on odd jobs and working with the other survivors of the storm. His confidence and optimism, despite the devastation around them, were contagious. He had an infectious belief that no matter how hard things got, they would find a way to keep going, to rebuild what had been lost. His unwavering attitude toward life made Janie feel like they could survive anything. His spirit lifted her in ways that no one else had ever done, and it became clear to her that his love was something she could not live without. For Janie, the quiet moments shared with Tea Cake became even more significant. They would sit together, often in the evenings after a long day of work, and talk about the past, the present, and what the future might hold. In these moments, Janie realized that Tea Cake was more than just a lover. He was a partner, a true companion who made her feel seen and heard in a way no one had before. It wasn't just the fun they had together or the passion that burned between them, but the way in which he respected her autonomy and her sense of self. Tea Cake had never tried to control her or impose his will upon her. Instead, he had given her the freedom to be herself, to explore who she was outside of the confines of marriage and societal expectations. But despite Tea Cake's optimism, the reality of their situation weighed heavily on both of them. Money was scarce, and the future remained uncertain. The harsh conditions of the Everglades meant that survival was a daily struggle. Janie and Tea Cake were not immune to the realities of life after the hurricane, and the constant pressure to rebuild their lives together began to take a toll on their relationship. As the months passed, the effects of their hardship began to manifest in unexpected ways. Janie's growing awareness of her vulnerability more pronounced. The uncertainty of their situation stirred old fears in her, fears of abandonment, of losing tea cake as she had lost others before. She was no longer the naive girl who had first met him in Eatonville. The woman who had lived through 3 marriages, each one leaving her more cautious and guarded, now found herself questioning the strength of her relationship with tea cake. Could it withstand the pressures of their challenging environment? Would the love that had once felt so certain continue to thrive? Or would it unravel, as she had seen so many things unravel in her life? Tea cake, for his part, remained steady, but his inner turmoil was not as easily visible. The weight of his responsibility to Janie, to their future, pressed down on him in ways that were less apparent to her. The constant strain of trying to make a living, of surviving each day, was wearing on him, and it became clear that he, too, was haunted by the fear of losing everything. His love for Janie had always been his anchor, but now, the uncertainty of their future seemed to threaten even that foundation. One night, after another long day of work and struggling to survive, Tea Cake took Janie's hand and led her outside. The moonlight illuminated their faces as they stood together in the quiet, looking out over the land that had once been full of promise, now reduced to rubble. In that moment, Janie felt both a deep sense of loss and a quiet, reassuring sense of hope. The world around them had changed, but they were still standing. They were still together. As Tea Cake talked about his dreams for the future, about the plans he had to rebuild their life, Janie listened with a mixture of awe and trepidation. His hope was contagious, but the fear she felt was still there, lurking beneath the surface. Could she truly put her trust in him, in their future together? Could their love withstand the hardships that lay ahead? And yet, as she looked into his eyes, she knew that there was no one else with whom she would rather face these challenges. The night was still and quiet, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. It was in this peaceful moment that Janie understood something profound. Their love, their relationship, was not just about surviving the storm. It was about learning to live fully in the aftermath. The storm had taken much from them, but it had also given them something invaluable, the opportunity to rebuild their love, to grow even stronger together. In this quiet, sacred moment, Janie knew that she would not face the future alone. Tea Cake had promised her that, and she trusted him with all her heart. It was then that Janie realized that love was not something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, even in the midst of loss and hardship. The true test of love was not whether it could survive the storms of life, but whether it could continue to thrive in their aftermath. Janie's life with Tea Cake, while filled with love, was not without its complications. As the weeks passed, their shared life in the Everglades became increasingly challenging. While their love for each other remained strong, they were constantly faced with the harsh realities of their existence. Janie had always been accustomed to the rhythms of nature, but the work on the land, the isolation, and the poverty were new and difficult. Tea Cake had promised to make their lives better, but promises alone could not change the weight of their circumstances. One of the most pressing challenges was money. Despite Tea Cake's tireless efforts to work and find new opportunities, they were still struggling financially. The world they had built together felt fragile in the face of these difficulties. The Everglades, once a vibrant place of opportunity, now seemed like a prison of sorts. Their cabin was small, cramped, and surrounded by the vast emptiness of the swamp, with no immediate prospects of improvement. While Janie had never been a materialistic woman, she had come to realize that the simple comforts and security she had once taken for granted in Eatonville were no longer available to her. Janie's growing sense of vulnerability began to manifest in ways she had not anticipated. She had always been an independent woman, but now she often found herself second-guessing her choices and her future. The memory of her past, her previous marriages, her lost dreams, haunted her, and it was easy to see how much of her self-worth had been tied to the stability and security of those relationships. Now, with Tea Cake, she was forced to confront a new reality, one where love alone could not always guarantee happiness, and where survival took precedence over the more tender emotions she had once cherished. Tea Cake, on the other hand, tried his best to keep their spirits up. His optimism and sense of humor were a lifeline for Janie, but even he began to feel the strain of their situation. He worked long hours, took on odd jobs, and did whatever he could to bring in money, but it often seemed like no matter how hard they worked, they couldn't get ahead. The social isolation, the struggle for survival, and the pressure to keep their love intact weighed heavily on both of them. There were moments of doubt, of frustration, and even of anger as the enormity of their situation became more and more apparent. Despite these hardships, Janie found herself more deeply in love with Tea Cake than ever before. There was something in his resilience, in the way he refused to give up, that made her admire him. She saw in him a man who, despite the world's hardships, still had the courage to dream. He dreamed of a better life for them, one where they could have a home and a family, and where they could live without fear of the future. These dreams, shared between them, gave Janie the strength to carry on. She knew that their love was worth the struggle, that the life they were building together, no matter how imperfect, was something beautiful. But love, as Janie was learning, was not a cure-all for life's challenges. One of the most difficult aspects of their relationship was the constant strain of the Everglades. In addition to the physical demands of the work, there was an underlying tension in the air, an awareness that their future was uncertain, and that things could change in an instant. Janie had lived through so much already, through the death of her first husband, through the pain of her second marriage, through the bitterness of the years she had spent in Eatonville, and she could not shake the fear that one day her life with Tea Cake might end as abruptly as the others had. This fear, though buried deep inside her, began to affect how she interacted with Tea Cake. She couldn't help but wonder, if something happened to him, what would she have left? Would she be able to survive once again, alone? The thought terrified her, and yet she couldn't escape it. The devastation of the hurricane had taught her how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could be taken away. Her heart ached with the knowledge that no matter how hard they tried, nothing in life was guaranteed. Tea Cake, sensing her unease, did his best to reassure her. He would talk about their future, about their plans for a better life. He spoke with such confidence, such certainty, that it was impossible for Janie not to believe in him, even if just for a moment. She loved him with all her heart, but the shadow of doubt remained, creeping in whenever she allowed herself to think too deeply about the future. One evening, after a long day of work, Janie and Tea Cake sat together by the fire, their bodies tired, but their spirits still connected. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the silence between them. Tea Cake, ever the optimist, spoke of the plans he had for their future. He dreamed of finding a piece of land where they could build a home together, a place where they could live peacefully and without worry. He talked about their future children, about the way their lives would be filled with joy and love. As he spoke, Janie listened, her heart swelling with love for him. She wanted to believe in his dreams, wanted to believe that everything would work out. And for a moment, as she looked into his eyes, she did believe. She believed in him, in them, and in the possibility of a life beyond the struggles they were enduring. But even as Tea Cake spoke of the future, Janie couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was as though the weight of her past, her experiences, her losses, and her fears was still present, lingering in the background of her mind. She had built her life around the idea of love, but now she was beginning to see that love alone could not carry her through the darkest times. It was in these moments of reflection, these quiet pauses in their conversations, that Janie truly began to understand the complexity of her feelings for Tea Cake and the challenges they would continue to face together. Her love for Tea Cake was deep, and yet she still struggled with the question of what the future held. Could they continue to live in the Everglades, making a life for themselves, or would the harsh realities of the world force them to separate? Would Tea Cake's dreams remain just that, dreams, or would they somehow become a reality? Janie couldn't answer these questions, but one thing was clear: whatever the future held, she knew she would face it with Tea Cake by her side. Together, they had already weathered so much, and no matter what came next, they would continue to face it together. As the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the atmosphere in the Everglades grew heavy with the anticipation of something ominous, something that could change everything. Tea Cake, ever the optimist, tried to reassure Janie, even as the wind began to pick up and the air grew thick with humidity. Janie, however, could sense the subtle shift in his demeanor. He was no longer speaking of their future with the same unwavering confidence. His voice now carried an edge of uncertainty, as though he, too, was aware of the looming threat. The hurricane was coming, and they were caught in its path. The days leading up to the storm were tense, filled with hushed conversations and preparations. Despite their best efforts, the storm was unstoppable, its intensity growing with every passing hour. Tea Cake had always prided himself on his ability to face adversity with courage, but even he could not ignore the looming danger of the hurricane. The Everglades, with its vast, open landscape and proximity to the water, was a perilous place to be in the face of such a storm. Janie, too, could feel the weight of the approaching disaster settling over her, her past losses resurfacing as she braced herself for the unknown. In the days before the hurricane struck, there was a sense of foreboding in the air. The usual rhythm of life in the Everglades was disrupted as people began to prepare for the storm. The small community was busy boarding up homes and securing their belongings, but there was a quiet recognition that, in the face of such a force of nature, there was little they could do to truly protect themselves. Janie had learned over the years that the world was unpredictable, that life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges her way. But this storm, this hurricane, felt different. It was as though everything she had built with Tea Cake was now at the mercy of nature, and there was no way to stop what was coming. Tea Cake, ever resourceful, tried to make the best of the situation. He insisted that they move to higher ground, away from the water and the low-lying areas that were most vulnerable to flooding. Janie, ever the loyal partner, followed his lead, trusting in his judgment even as her heart raced with fear. Together, they joined the other residents of the Everglades, fleeing to a nearby barn to seek shelter from the storm. The atmosphere in the barn was tense, filled with the anxious murmurs of men, women, and children who had come to terms with the fact that they could not escape the hurricane. The wind howled outside, shaking the structure and causing the roof to creak under the pressure. As the hurricane raged on, the barn became a refuge from the fury of the storm, but it also became a symbol of the uncertainty that had come to define Janie's life. She had always sought stability, peace, and love, but here, in the midst of nature's wrath, she was reminded that nothing in life was certain. The storm was a force beyond her control, and as the wind and rain battered the barn, Janie's thoughts turned inward. She thought of her first 2 marriages, of the losses and betrayals that had shaped her understanding of love. She thought of the way she had been forced to fight for her own happiness, to assert her independence in a world that had often sought to limit her. And now, with Tea Cake, she had finally found a love that felt pure, that felt real. But as the hurricane raged outside, she couldn't help but wonder if this, too, was something that would slip away, beyond her grasp. Tea Cake, however, remained focused on the present. He did not allow himself to be consumed by fear, even as the storm continued to worsen. He held Janie close, offering her comfort in the midst of the chaos. His love for her was unwavering, and he made it clear that no matter what happened, they would face it together. His strength gave Janie the courage to push aside her own fears and hold on to the belief that they could make it through this, that they would survive the storm together. In those moments, when the world outside seemed to be falling apart, Janie felt the depth of their connection, the bond that had sustained them through so much already. But the hurricane was relentless, and as the night wore on, the storm reached its peak. The wind howled with such intensity that it seemed as though the very earth was being torn apart. The rain came in torrents, slashing against the barn like 1,000 arrows. The darkness outside was complete, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the terrifying landscape. Inside the barn, the air was thick with fear, the sounds of the storm drowning out all other noises. Janie clung to Tea Cake, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized just how fragile their existence truly was. In the midst of the chaos, there was a moment when Janie's fear reached its peak. The barn, which had seemed like a safe haven just hours before, now felt as though it might collapse at any moment. The wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, and Janie feared that the roof might give way. The people inside were terrified, and the sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. In that moment, Janie's mind flashed back to the years she had spent in Eatonville, to the way she had once thought she could control her destiny. She had believed that she could choose her own path, that she could create a life of peace and contentment. But now, in the face of the hurricane's fury, she understood that there were forces in life that no one could control. Tea Cake, sensing her fear, spoke softly to her, his words a steadying presence in the storm. He told her that they would make it through this, that no matter how hard the winds blew or how strong the rain fell, they would survive. His calmness was like a balm for Janie's anxious heart. She took comfort in his words, allowing them to wash over her, even as the storm continued to rage outside. Through it all, Janie remained by Tea Cake's side, holding on to the love they had built together. The hurricane, as destructive as it was, became a symbol of the unpredictability of life, a reminder that no matter how hard we try to protect ourselves, there are always forces beyond our control. Yet, in the face of those forces, there is also the possibility of finding strength in love, in connection, and in the resilience of the human spirit. The storm had ravaged the Everglades, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The barn, once a safe refuge, was now a shell of its former self, battered by the fury of nature. The wind, now receding, still carried a bitter chill, and the rain had turned the ground into a swamp of mud and debris. Yet, amid the devastation, Janie and Tea Cake were alive, and that alone was a testament to their strength and resilience. But the aftermath of the storm held more than just physical destruction. It left a psychological scar, an unsettling reminder that even the most steadfast love could be threatened by forces beyond their control. In the days that followed, as the storm clouds drifted away, the community began to rebuild. The landscape had changed, as if the hurricane had wiped the slate clean, leaving everything in disarray. The once familiar path through the Everglades was now unrecognizable, and the houses that had stood so proudly were reduced to rubble. Despite the immense loss, there was a sense of quiet determination in the air. The people, though weary, were determined to start over, to piece together their lives from the remnants left by the storm. Janie, too, found herself facing this new reality, one where she was no longer just a witness to destruction, but a participant in the rebuilding process. Tea Cake, ever the optimist, encouraged Janie to focus on the future, to let go of the past and embrace the opportunities that lay ahead. His spirit, though wounded by the storm's devastation, remained unbroken. He had always been a man who found joy in the small things, whether it was playing a hand of cards with friends or simply walking through the fields with Janie. He believed that they could rebuild their lives, not just in the physical sense, but emotionally and spiritually as well. His love for Janie was unwavering, and in the midst of the chaos, it was the one constant that kept him grounded. Janie, however, was more cautious. The storm had shaken her, not just because of the physical damage it caused, but because of the emotional toll it had taken on her. She had lost so much in her life: her first marriage to Logan Killix, a man who had never truly loved her; her second marriage to Joe Starks, a man who had sought to control her every move. And now, she feared, she might lose Tea Cake too, to the cruel hand of fate. She had learned that love, no matter how pure, was fragile. It could be swept away in an instant, as easily as the storm had torn through the Everglades. For the first time in her life, Janie felt the weight of her own vulnerability. Despite her reservations, Janie followed Tea Cake's lead, helping him to rebuild their small house. Together, they worked side by side, hauling debris, fixing the roof, and clearing the yard. The task was grueling, and yet, as they labored, Janie found herself reconnecting with the simple joys that had once defined her relationship with Tea Cake. She realized that, in their shared work, they were building more than just a house. They were rebuilding their love, their sense of purpose, and their shared vision for the future. It was a quiet, intimate act of healing, one that allowed them to reclaim the bond they had forged amid the storm's fury. As the days passed, Janie's fears began to subside. She began to understand that love, like the land itself, could be rebuilt after it had been torn apart. It required patience, resilience, and the willingness to face the unknown with open eyes. She had spent much of her life searching for a love that would sustain her, and in Tea Cake, she had found it. But she had also learned that love could not shield them from the world's cruelties. It could only offer a source of strength to weather the storms, both literal and figurative, that life would inevitably bring. Despite the progress they made, the specter of the storm still lingered in the air. It was as though the hurricane had left its mark on everything it touched, its destructive power forever etched into the landscape. The memories of that night, the howling wind, the crashing waves, the fear that had gripped Janie's heart, were not easily forgotten. Yet, in the aftermath, Janie found herself realizing something profound. The storm, with all its violence and chaos, had not destroyed her. It had merely tested her resilience, and in doing so, it had allowed her to emerge stronger than before. The Everglades, too, had begun to heal. The land, scarred by the storm, was slowly coming back to life. The grass had started to grow again, and the birds were returning to their nests. The people, though weary from the struggle, were learning to live with the scars of the storm. The hurricane had changed the world, but it had not defeated it. It had merely shifted the balance, forcing the people to adapt, to grow, and to rebuild in ways they never imagined. For Janie, the storm had become a metaphor for her life. She had weathered so many storms, emotional, physical, and psychological, that she had come to understand the true nature of strength. It was not about being unbreakable. It was about finding the courage to stand up after being knocked down, to rebuild after everything had been shattered. The hurricane, in its fury, had given her the opportunity to understand this truth in a way that nothing else could. It had given her the chance to see the world and herself through new eyes. Tea Cake, too, had been transformed by the storm. The man who had once been carefree and playful had been humbled by the raw power of nature. Yet, even in his vulnerability, he had shown Janie the depth of his love and commitment. He had been her rock during the storm, and now, as they worked together to rebuild their lives, he was once again the partner she had come to rely on. Their love had been tested, but it had not been broken. It had emerged from the storm stronger, more resilient, and more enduring than ever before. As Janie stood beside Tea Cake, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. The storm had come and gone, and though its aftermath was still being felt, she knew that she and Tea Cake had faced it together. They had survived, not because they were invincible, but because they had chosen to face the storm with love, courage, and determination. In that moment, Janie understood that life was not about avoiding the storms. It was about learning how to dance in the rain. The culmination of Janie's journey is a quiet one, not marked by dramatic speeches or grandiose moments, but by a simple realization of her own strength, her self-awareness, and the peace that she has fought for throughout her life. After all the turmoil, the pain, and the love lost and found, Janie sits alone on her porch in Eatonville, gazing at the horizon as the sun sets. Her hair, once a symbol of the control others tried to exert over her, flows freely in the wind, and she feels the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. It's in this moment of solitude that she fully understands the significance of her journey. The long road that has taken her from the girl who was searching for herself to the woman who has come to know her worth and her place in the world. Janie's story is one of self-discovery, and through her struggles, she learns that real fulfillment doesn't come from external validation or the approval of others. It comes from within, from the courage to live authentically and to embrace one's own desires and needs without shame or fear. For much of her life, Janie lived in the shadows of others' expectations, first under the dominance of her grandmother Nanny, then under the control of Logan Killicks and Joe Starks. These relationships, though they each had their moments of love and connection, ultimately left Janie feeling stifled, unheard, and unseen. It wasn't until her relationship with Tea Cake that Janie truly began to experience love as an equal partnership, one that honored her autonomy, her voice, and her desires. Through her love for Tea Cake, Janie learns that true love doesn't suppress or dominate, it frees. Tea Cake, despite his flaws, offers Janie the space to be herself, to experience life in its fullness and complexity. Their relationship is not without its challenges, but it is in those very challenges that Janie finds herself. When the hurricane strikes, devastating the land around them, it is a moment that forces Janie to confront the fragility of life and the nature of survival. Tea Cake, though he is vulnerable to the storm's power, never stops believing in their love and their ability to rebuild. His death, a tragic and brutal turn in the novel, marks the end of a chapter in Janie's life, but does not diminish the growth she has experienced through their time together. His loss is profound, but it is not all-consuming. She has learned through her time with him to stand strong in the face of adversity, to endure, and to live her life as fully as she can, no matter the circumstances. The storm that ravages the Everglades can be seen as a metaphor for the emotional and spiritual upheaval Janie experiences throughout the novel. It represents not just the external forces that threaten her physical safety, but the inner turmoil that has long existed in her heart. The storm's aftermath leaves Janie with the realization that she is the one who has the power to rebuild, to find peace, and to understand the true nature of her heart. The hurricane, the symbol of chaos and destruction, has made her stronger, more grounded, and more capable of weathering whatever comes her way. The fact that Janie returns to Eatonville alone at the end of the novel is significant. Her return is not an indication of failure or retreat, but rather a symbol of triumph. She has lived through so much, her 3 marriages, the turbulent relationship with Tea Cake, his death, and yet she returns to her roots, to the place where she first began her search for identity, but now with a newfound sense of self. She no longer needs to explain herself to the townspeople, who are still gossiping about her, still judging her choices. They do not understand her, and Janie no longer feels the need to make them understand. She knows her own truth, and that is enough. In the final scene, Janie's reflective solitude is an act of empowerment. She sits on her porch, feeling the winds blow through her hair, and in this moment, she is at peace with her past and with herself. She has lived through hardship, endured loss, and found love that, though imperfect, was the most liberating force in her life. Tea Cake's death, while painful, has not broken her spirit. Instead, it has allowed her to realize that love, even in its absence, has shaped her in ways that nothing else could. she has come to understand that love is not a destination or a prize to be won, but a journey that is ever-changing, challenging, and ultimately transformative. Janie's transformation is also a reflection of the broader themes Hurston explores throughout the novel. The search for identity, the power dynamics within relationships, and the complexity of love all resonate with timeless relevance. In a world that often silences the voices of women, particularly Black women, Janie's story is one of reclaiming her voice and her autonomy. Her life is a testament to the resilience and strength of the human spirit, especially the spirit of those who have historically been marginalized. Hurston's novel presents a nuanced, multifaceted portrayal of Black womanhood, one that refuses to be defined by the limitations others try to place on it. It is a story of agency, of claiming the right to define oneself on one's own terms, despite the many obstacles that life throws in the way. Janie's final reflection on her journey, her understanding of the power of her own voice, and her peaceful return to Eatonville are a recognition of how far she has come. She has gained the wisdom that only comes from lived experience, and it is through that wisdom that she can finally sit in peace, knowing that she has fought for her right to be who she truly is. Hurston's novel is a powerful reminder that we all have the power to weather life's storms, to rebuild, and to reclaim our own peace and happiness, no matter what we may have lost along the way. Janie's story is not just her own. It is a universal story of growth, transformation, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. Ultimately, their eyes were watching God leaves readers with a deep sense of hope that even in the most challenging and painful of circumstances, there is the possibility of rebirth, renewal, and personal empowerment. Janie's story is a celebration of life's complexities, and it reminds us that our struggles do not define us. It is how we rise above them, how we learn and grow from them, that shapes who we truly are. Janie's journey is a beautiful, poignant reminder that, at the end of the day, it is our own hearts that hold the key to our freedom, and it is in our own hands to decide how to live, love, and ultimately find peace. In the quiet after the storm, Janie's journey comes full circle. Through love, loss, and the endless quest for self-understanding, she has discovered not just who she is, but who she wants to become. Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God is not just a story about a woman's search for love, but about her search for autonomy, strength, and identity. Throughout Janie's life, she is constantly seeking more freedom, more expression, and more depth in her relationships. Hurston captures the profound complexity of these themes with a lyrical prose that both celebrates and mourns the human condition. The storm, which serves as a pivotal metaphor in the novel, brings forth the full range of human emotions: fear, loss, survival, and resilience. It is within this chaotic force of nature that Janie is reborn, shedding the layers of societal expectation, the stifling grip of past relationships, and embracing the woman she has become. The hurricane isn't just a physical event. It represents the trials and struggles that Janie has faced throughout her life, each one forcing her to confront parts of herself she may have never wanted to face. The storm may have left destruction in its wake, but it also cleared the path for new growth. It showed Janie that love, though tested and fragile, has the power to rebuild. Through Janie's relationships with her three husbands, Logan, Joe, and Tea Cake, She learns that love is not something to be possessed or controlled, but a force that evolves, sustains, and challenges. The love she shares with Tea Cake, built on mutual respect and understanding, provides the foundation for her personal rebirth. Yet, it is not the perfect love she once imagined. It is, however, the one that allows her to stand tall in the face of adversity, to reclaim her voice, and to assert her autonomy. Tea Cake teaches her that love does not have to be stifling, that it is something to be freely given and freely received, as an equal and shared experience. By the end of the novel, Janie has come full circle, from the quiet, passive girl who was constantly searching for approval and identity in others, to the self-assured woman who knows her worth and her power. The final scene, where she returns to Eatonville alone, is not one of defeat but of triumph. She has walked her own path, and though others may judge her, she has found the peace and contentment she sought all along. Hurston leaves us with the image of Janie, sitting under the tree, having weathered her storms, and finally at peace with herself. Their eyes were watching God is more than just Janie's story. It is the story of anyone who has sought love, identity, and personal freedom against the backdrop of societal expectation and personal turmoil. Hurston's masterpiece resonates with readers across generations because it touches upon universal themes of love, loss, and the search for self-empowerment. It speaks to the struggles of women, especially Black women, in finding their voice and their place in a world that often tries to silence them. Yet, the novel's conclusion, Janie's quiet strength in the face of judgment, and her unshakable sense of self-worth, serves as a powerful reminder that, no matter the storm, we have the ability to rebuild ourselves, find our voice, and reclaim our peace. Through Janie's story, Hurston teaches us that self-love, resilience, and the courage to be true to ourselves are the greatest gifts we can give to our own lives.